In the 1950s, neurosurgeons developed a groundbreaking treatment for epilepsy known as the callosotomy, also commonly referred to as the split brain procedure, wherein the connective structure between the brain hemispheres, the corpus callosum, was severed. While this procedure effectively treated the patient's epilepsy, it also produced a remarkable effect, wherein the patients seemed to be split, as though they were struggling against themselves. One hand would attempt to reach for a snack, only to be slapped away by the other hand. This is when scientists first began to understand the divided nature of the human brain, and much of the information we have about the psychological differences between the right and left hemispheres comes from experiments with split brain patients. For example, an image was shown to the left side, and the patient was asked to say what they saw. But since the ability to speak comes from the left hemisphere, which is connected to the right eye, the patient simply says that they saw nothing. But when asked to use their left hand to select amongst objects which corresponded to the picture, they could do so easily. When shown a series of images on the left side, before being suddenly shown a nude image, the patient usually laughed or blushed, but when asked what they saw, they replied that they saw nothing. They can see the pictures, and even react to them emotionally, but they can't say what they saw. The split brain procedure opened a window into the workings of the human mind, allowing scientists to study each hemisphere in isolation. These studies, as well as various other procedures, have produced a wealth of knowledge which demonstrate that you do in fact have two distinct personalities. As we discussed in the last video, the left hemisphere is much better able to focus intently, and it does this by filtering irrelevant content, pushing it into the background. This famous demonstration, link in the description, shows this in action, and I encourage you to pause the video and check this out if you're unfamiliar with it. This ability to focus is achieved cognitively by producing a distilled version of the world, a kind of map of reality, which allows us to place things into categories. This mental map is a representation of the world. As McGilchrist writes, we have to be able to recognize, recognize what we experience. To say that this is a such and such, that is, it has certain qualities that enable me to place it in a category of things that I have experienced before, and about which I have certain beliefs and feelings. This processing eventually becomes so automatic that we do not so much experience the world, as experience our representation of the world. The world is no longer present to us, but represented, a virtual world, a copy that exists in conceptual form in the mind. In other words, the left hemisphere imposes ideas it already understands, in order to recognize what it perceives. For example, take a look at this picture which I intentionally blurred. Right away, your mind tries to make out what it is, but when I tell you that the image is of an F-16 fighter jet, you may be able to recognize the details. Me telling you what it is causes you to quickly categorize this image according to what you know, which is why when I show you the actual image of an alligator, your mind recategorizes it. In either case, we are drawing from previous mental images in order to understand the object. This mental map is filled with everything we have learned about the world and our assumptions, and our cognitive maps act as a sort of filter which helps to simplify the world and focus on things which are important. But problems can emerge if we begin to live in this map and act like it's real. Much of our capacity to use the world depends not on an attempt to open ourselves as much as possible to apprehending whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, but instead on apprehending what I have brought into being for myself, my representation of it. This is the remit of the left hemisphere, and would appear to require a selective, highly focused attention. Many people, in fact, are more engaged with their simplified mental maps than with the actual world. While the left hemisphere creates a virtual world, the right hemisphere is better at apprehending what actually exists out there with no preconceptions. It doesn't impose what it already assumes about the world onto it, but rather takes the world as it is, perceiving the world without dividing it. The right hemisphere, as birds and animals show, is on the lookout. It has to be open to whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, as much as possible without preconceptions, not just focusing on what it already knows or is interested in. This requires a mode of attention that is broader and more flexible than that of the left hemisphere. Because the left hemisphere is better at focused attention, and the right hemisphere is better at broad attention, right hemisphere damage can permanently narrow a person's window of attention. The left hemisphere prefers what it has already experienced and already knows based on the map which it has generated, which is why it is responsible for confirmation bias. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, is better at dealing with new experiences. In general, new experiences are processed by the right hemisphere, and once they become familiar, they become the remit of the left hemisphere. This is why the right hemisphere is much better at thinking flexibly and thinking outside the box, whereas the left hemisphere denies discrepancies which don't conform to its preformed ideas. For example, You may know that the Great Wall of China is the only man-made structure which is visible from space, except this fact isn't true. If you were previously told this and firmly believed it, the left hemisphere becomes engaged when you hear this fact being confirmed, and has a hard time letting go of this previous belief. But the right hemisphere is what is able to consider the possibility that this is wrong, and once you accept it as a fact, the left hemisphere will then acknowledge this, and represent this new information as its preconception. This means it is possible to update our cognitive maps, but the information must first pass through the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is therefore important whenever we want to adopt a new perspective, and consider possibilities beyond what we already presume. The fact that the left hemisphere narrows our understanding to what is familiar can also be demonstrated when we process a sentence. When the man heard the thunder, he rose from his seat. Pay attention to the word rose. What does it mean? In this context, it clearly means that he got up from his seat. But why didn't you interpret it to mean this rose? This is because the left hemisphere suppresses the other meanings of the word rose based on this context. The right hemisphere almost does the opposite, and is able to think of meanings beyond what is immediately relevant. This is why the right hemisphere is able to understand metaphorical and non-literal meaning, since it is open to other possible interpretations, and this is what allows it to understand subtext. Therefore, the right hemisphere has the advantage when it comes to creativity. It has more connections between faraway brain regions, which allows it to think in a freer, less confined style. The ability to conceive of new ideas, which fall outside the remit of the familiar, is largely possible due to the right hemisphere, and so it allows us to think quite deeply about the nature of things. Interestingly, this occurs when we try not to focus on something. If you are trying to remember the answer to a test, the more you try to focus your mind to come up with the answer, the more constrained your mind will be, and the harder it is to recall. This is why relaxing your mind broadens its thinking. Since efforts of will focus attention and deliberately narrow its range, it may be that cessation of the effort to produce something, relaxation in other words, favors creativity because it permits broadening of attention, and, with the expansion of the attentional field, engagement of the right hemisphere. When we perceive anything, the right hemisphere is first engaged, then the left hemisphere attempts to impose its prior ideas, and then the right hemisphere is engaged again to ground this perception. This is why we first perceive this as an H before breaking it down into E's. We don't perceive the parts first, but rather the whole, before the left hemisphere breaks up the parts. The left hemisphere modifies the original picture, first perceived by the right hemisphere, and then adds to your understanding of the whole. So take this painting. First you perceive it all together, but when you look at the individual elements, like the fact that this lady has a monkey, you use this fact to modify the previous image that you had. Notice that your conscious mind scans for these individual details before you unconsciously understand the whole painting, which has now been modified by consciousness. The right hemisphere is better at processing the Gestalt, i.e. the whole. The Gestalt perception of the right hemisphere can be shown well through this image. At first we see the dots until suddenly the image of the Dalmatian emerges. Notice, however, that we don't construct the image of the Dalmatian by adding up the bits. Rather, it comes to us all at once. This is also what allows it to understand context, which always remains in the unconscious. If we look at the previous sentence again, you read and understand each element of the sentence through the left hemisphere, but that feeling that you understood the entire thing comes from the right hemisphere reconstructing the whole thing. It also adds in the context of this being a demonstration in a YouTube video that you are watching. In the back of your mind are all of the other facts which I presented earlier, and these are unconsciously informing how you interpret this. It would be a very different experience if you skipped to this part of the video without watching the beginning. On the other hand, the left hemisphere produces abstractions away from context in order to generate its simplified map. This is why it takes words to be literal signs, and isn't good at understanding humor or sarcasm, since these are the non-literal aspects of language. Every situation of your life is unique, but the left hemisphere represents any situation as an abstraction using language. Think about it. A word is a way to represent a very general idea. For example, the word soldier doesn't refer to any specific soldier, but rather to the idea in general. General. If you notice that connection, that was your right hemisphere, because the left would otherwise suppress this definition. The word itself stands for the object, almost like it is a schematic, and this is what we mean when we say that the left hemisphere produces abstractions. The right hemisphere doesn't produce abstractions, but actually engages with the uniqueness of being, and so for it, the idea of a soldier is connected with various ideas which you might associate with the concept of a soldier. usually based on your own experiences, but these are understood unconsciously. This is part of the reason why the right hemisphere is more engaged by living beings, since living things are unique and situational. The left hemisphere, on the other hand, is more engaged by inanimate objects, which actually makes it much better at using tools, which is reflected in the fact that most of us use our right hands when working with tools. The living and the inanimate is one of the distinctions, which is reflected by the hemispheres, and it demonstrates how they see the world in different ways. One is lifeless and mechanical, the other is vibrant and full of vital energy. This makes the right hemisphere better at recognizing faces and distinguishing between different, unique individuals. Individuals are, after all, Gestalt wholes, whose entirety we understand at once. We can use words to describe a person, but the only way to truly know what a person is like is to meet them in person and get a feel for who they are, rather than merely describing them with words. Related to this is the fact that the right hemisphere is more empathetic, and it is more willing to understand the perspective and feelings of others. When children imitate their parents, it is from an empathetic desire to put themselves in their parents' position. The theory of mind results from empathy, since it is how we recognize that other beings have their own minds and can see the world from a particular vantage point. Empathy is also related to the depth of emotionality, and the right hemisphere is more deeply connected with the body's limbic system, which regulates emotions. The right hemisphere is able to feel powerful emotions from elation to despair. Again, this reflects the more unconscious processing of the right hemisphere, since emotions operate unconsciously. The left hemisphere is, by comparison, emotionally neutral, which also makes it unconcerned with the emotions of others, since its primary concern is utility. Because it doesn't understand emotions very well, it has a tendency to view other people as mechanical objects. The one exception to this emotional neutrality is anger. The left hemisphere is largely involved when we feel angry. This is why the right hemisphere is much better at engaging with others at a social level, since empathy is needed in order to properly communicate. The right hemisphere is also better at processing emotions from the voice and the face. When you see this face, you can quickly determine the emotion being conveyed. It isn't like you examine each part of the face and consciously come to a conclusion. Rather, you see the face all at once and empathetically feel that the person must be sad. So while unconscious emotional processing is carried out by the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere consciously labels emotions and categorizes them. In fact, the left hemisphere is more associated with consciousness as a whole, and is therefore involved whenever we possess a deliberate will. When we force ourselves to smile, for example, without actually feeling happy, this is the left hemisphere, since this requires deliberate effort. But when we smile unconsciously because we are genuinely happy, this is mediated by the right hemisphere. Recall how we characterize consciousness. It is linear, sequential, and explicit. Take this logic puzzle, for example. 5 people were eating apples. A finished before B, but behind C. D finished before E, but behind B. What was the finishing order? To do this question requires holding different ideas in mind and manipulating them, and placing them in the correct order. This is explicit reasoning, and is largely carried out by the left hemisphere, although certain parts involve the right. Implicit reasoning, where the answer more or less comes to us automatically, without needing to use deliberate effort, is carried out by the right side. Take this puzzle for instance. There is a barrel with no lid, and some wine in it. This barrel of wine is more than half full, says the woman. No, it's not, says the man. It's less than half full. Without any measuring implements, and without removing any wine from the barrel, how can they easily determine who is correct? A puzzle like this doesn't have a clear way to solve it like the last one, and requires some creative thinking. In fact, the harder you think about it, the more your thinking may be constrained, and you may try to use solutions which worked for other puzzles which you've solved before. But if you do come up with the answer, it will probably just come to you after some deliberation. This is known as insight, and is better performed by the right hemisphere, which isn't confined to prior assumptions. I'll leave the answer in the description in case you want to work it out for yourself. Here's another weird fact about the hemispheres. The left hemisphere seems to prefer the color red, while the right hemisphere prefers the color green. This may have to do with the fact that red is associated with fruits, and we need to be highly focused when picking fruit and using the right hand. The hemispheres also have different relationships to the body. The left hemisphere is more likely to view the body as a mechanical object, and the conscious mind has a tendency to feel like it is dissociated from the body, almost like we are floating above our bodies. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, feels like it is deeply connected to the body, that we are our bodies, rather than being detached from them. McGilchrist writes of one woman with right hemisphere damage who could not identify her own body, believing that her own hand was actually her mother's. Interestingly, when the left hemisphere was inactivated, she began to identify the arm as belonging to herself rather than her mother. Music is actually processed more by the right hemisphere, which makes sense since music fills us with emotions and also connects us with our bodies through dance. Furthermore, music doesn't work its effects upon us when we consciously deliberate upon it. Rather, we feel music unconsciously, and each piece of music is unique, in the same way that individuals are unique. We can classify songs according to genre, which is the remit of the left hemisphere, but being engaged by the uniqueness of an individual song is the remit of the right hemisphere. This is why music can fill us with emotions which are not easy to convey. Even two sad songs fill us with very different kinds of sadness, which language has a hard time expressing. Now, due to the self-referential nature of the left hemisphere, it tends to be quite convinced that it understands something, whereas the right hemisphere is more ambiguous and uncertain. The left hemisphere also has a tendency to fabricate in order to justify itself. Recall the experiment I mentioned earlier, where an image of a nude woman is flashed to the left side. The patient usually responded by giggling, but when asked why they were laughing, they generally just came up with some fabrication, like that they remembered a funny joke, and it isn't necessarily that they are deliberately lying, because the left hemisphere does become convinced by whatever reality it fabricates. This is why you can be skeptical of someone if they come up with a justification after they have made a decision, since it is likely the left hemisphere trying to preserve its pride. Whenever the left hemisphere comes up with a rule, it tends to stick with this without considering other possibilities. For example, if it finds a solution for one problem, it will try to apply the same solution to a different problem. This can lead us to stereotyping, and so if we see a cat that likes water, we make the assumption that all cats like water, until of course we find a counterexample, and the previous idea breaks down. This also makes the left hemisphere sensitive to criticism, since it is firmly attached to its old ideas, and rejects information which it sees as a challenge to its own perspective. The right hemisphere is able to change perspectives more seamlessly. You may have seen this image before, and your left hemisphere categorizes it into either a duck or a rabbit, but to change from one or the other, the right hemisphere is what allows you to interpret it the other way, by first inhibiting the left hemisphere's original conception. So if you see a rabbit first, the right hemisphere allows you to see the duck. This is also related to the ego, since our idea of ourselves is connected with our beliefs about the world. The left hemisphere is connected with our sense of selves, especially as a willing agent. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, sees ourselves within the context of others, and within the narrative of our lives. To put it another way, the left hemisphere feels itself to be the protagonist, but the right hemisphere understands the story in which this protagonist is embedded. Both hemispheres are needed for the ego, but the actual feeling of the ego acting with its own will and being conscious comes predominantly from the left hemisphere, especially since consciousness is also like a map of reality. All of the available evidence suggests that we do in fact have two personalities that perceive the world in fundamentally different ways. What's more, the structure of the brain and the way it is divided has played an immense role in shaping the human world, particularly the left hemisphere, which has allowed us to focus very intensely on a few tasks, which is needed in today's world of bureaucracy. However, McGilchrist believes that while the left hemisphere has been instrumental in human civilization, it may also be leading us towards a dark path, which may in fact destroy the civilization which it helped to spawn. In upcoming videos, we will explain exactly why the left hemisphere is a threat to the modern world.